A few years ago, I had a chance to meet a fellow that I followed his baseball career, Tim Burke. If you're a baseball guy, you probably remember the name. Mostly a reliever, pitched for the Twins, the Mets, and the Yankees. And I think he has a World Series ring, and I think one year he was an all-star. Neat Christian guy, married to a lady named Christina. And for years, they couldn't have children. And so they adopted 4 different kids that were all special needs kids. And as it turned out, all 4 of these kids had what's called reactive attachment disorder. Reactive attachment disorder. The short story here is that all 4 of them, they just could not take care of them. And they all needed long-term care in an institution. You can imagine the heartache as parents that these 2 went through with the situation. The joys of bringing in a new kid adopted, and all the heartache about trying to take care of this kid, and then the kids having to be put in an institution. They did have a 5th child that was their biological child. But at 10 months old, this child needed surgery, brain surgery. And the surgery did not go well. And they told the parents that the child was likely to have permanent brain damage all of its life. Now, if you're a Christian, or if you're not a Christian, what's the first question that comes to your mind? God, do you know about this? Do you care? Are you doing anything about the issues in our life? We've prayed about these things for years and nothing seems to change. And if you've been a Christian a while and you've been through something like this, you identify with the story. Maybe not with all the horrors of the details of the story. But there are certainly things in our lives for which we have prayed for years and years and years. And it appears to us, from our finite point of view, that nothing has happened. And the question that rages in you is something like, does God care? Does he hear? And is he doing something anyway? And one of the things that you come to realize is the metric that we use to determine or measure God's care is always the same metric. And apparently it's an inadequate metric. And that is God doing something about the problems that I'm going through? That's how we determine if God cares or not. And when God does come through with the problem, then we think, praise the Lord, and God is good, and thankful, and God answers prayer. But when things don't change, or when they get worse, like in the story that we're going to read today, then the question of, does God care, if the metric is he changing my situation, perhaps we're using the wrong metric. In fact, we're probably using a metric that is way too inferior to the metric that God uses in our lives, as we'll see in our story today. When I think about this, I think about if you ever raised teenagers and your teenager asked, hey, on prom night, there's a bunch of us that want to go to Mexico after the dance and spend the night down there. Is it okay if we go? Everybody else's parents have said yes. And if you dare to say no, because you're horrified by that, the teenager may say, you don't care. Now, that's their metric. That's the metric at which they determine your care. However, in your situation as the parent, it's clear to you that the metric they're using is inferior. You care way more than they have any idea. That's something of our story that we're going to look at today. There are 2 main characters that we're going to look at. And mostly this comes from the book of Mark, but also comes from the book of Luke. And this starts out in Luke chapter 8, verse 40. Now when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Now, returned from where? Well, before we had our Christmas messages, the last message we did from Mark was the man of the tombs. And he had crossed the lake, and they'd had the great storm that the disciples and they'd watched him still the storm. And then the next week, the man of the tombs message. And now he's returned back across to Galilee. And when he comes back, there is a crowd, Luke says, that welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Mark says, Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. Pressed around him. You're going to see what a crowd pressing around one another is tonight if you look at Times Square. And the police are busy all day going through every single person who enters there and putting them all in different pens. And as I've heard, they're all warned there are no bathrooms in here and no restaurants. So be on your guard. But you're going to see a huge crowd of people pressing against one another. That's something of the picture that both Mark and Luke record here. And then Luke 8:41, we have our first character, a man named Jairus. A ruler of the synagogue came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading. So here, imagine, here's this crowd of people all around Jesus. They all want to pushing and shoving, all trying to get closer. And this frantic father comes up and throws himself at the feet of Jesus, pleading. What's he pleading with? Because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. And he knew there was nothing he could do about this. It's a helpless situation. There's only one thing possible to find this fellow named Jesus. As Jesus was on his way, Luke continues, the crowds almost crushed him. Now try to put this in your head. When I think about the crowds crushing him, one of the pictures that comes to my mind is over in the Middle East at Mecca, whenever they have that big Hajj, I think that's what it's called, and you see that aerial view of maybe 100,000 people in this big square. And one of the things that's always sad about this to me is that there's usually some kind of mob thing that goes on, and a number of people are crushed to death in this. Something of that is going on with this situation. A large crowd, and pressed upon him, Luke says, almost crushed him. Then verse 25 of Mark 5, the second character of the story comes, besides Jairus. A woman was there, as a part of the crowd, who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. Now, think about this woman. We don't know any more details about her physical condition than this. 12 years of bleeding. Now, not 12 days of bleeding. Not 12 weeks of bleeding. 12 years of bleeding. And I only had 3 years of pre-med courses, so I am not a doctor. But I do know that the body is always making new red blood cells. And I'm assuming that if this woman is bleeding for 12 years around the clock, that also the body is sort of in overdrive, having to make more red blood cells. And so the question I wonder about with this woman is, does she deal with just this chronic sense of anemia? You know, again, I'm not a doctor, but it's just trying to put myself in her situation. But the physical aspect of this, I think, pales in comparison to the personal aspect of her story. Because what Mark says in verse 26, she suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors, and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. And Mark describes three things of this woman's personal story. She was in the realm of suffering, and that all the doctors combined had not been able to help her. In fact, it had gotten worse. What's implied is through their work. And she had emptied out not only her checking account, but her savings account and her IRA, and there was nothing left. That's the personal condition at which she finds herself. And when I think of her in this situation, I think about Tim Burke. Here she's in a situation that she's been in for 12 years where she is just absolutely helpless. And you wonder, is she hopeless as well? So she sees that Jesus is coming back. She's working. He's working himself through this crowd. Verse 27, when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Now, I remember reading this story many, many years ago, and it's an easy story just to sort of to read in an antiseptic way. It's pretty cool. The woman walks up behind him and bends down and touches his garment, and wow, magical things happen. She's healed. And yet, that's not the situation that's painted by Mark and Luke. When I was a kid, my parents, we lived in New Orleans, my parents took me to Mardi Gras. And the three of us kids were so excited. Never been to Mardi Gras. But we were down there where all the floats come by and all the people in their get up and their masquerades and costumes, and the people on their floats are throwing candy. And I think I was 6 or 7 years old. But the crowd was so large and was in constant flux that you really were not standing in the same place for very long. You were moving some way through the whole time. And the only way that I could see any of the floats or the people on the floats was if my dad reached down and put me up on his shoulder. Then I could see, and I had a chance of trying to catch some candy if it came my way. Now, I had a little sister and a little brother, so we all kind of took turns on my dad's shoulders. But the situation of this massive humanity is what Mark and Luke paint, and this is where she finds herself. Secondly, is that Jesus is moving through this crowd as sort of like a moving target. And I can picture her thinking, is it really worth it to try to get through all these people and to try to get to him? And she has to make some decisions pretty quick because it's he's sort of passing by. And then it seems to be like he's in something of a hurry. And I don't know if she could see Jairus, and probably Jairus had a hold of Jesus' arm and pulling him through the crowd to get back to his home so that Jesus might be able to heal his 12-year-old daughter. But there's something of being in a hurry. She lived in a male-dominated society, and I wonder if inside there was something about, I don't know if I should bother. I don't know if I should really do this. And the picture you have of her in this verse and in verses to follow is something of the invisible woman, just kind of incognito. Just the person that just kind of comes and sits and doesn't want to make a stir, doesn't want to be a bother, and just kind of lets things go on. But she has to make this decision all within seconds. But she decides to make her way through the crowd, and as Jesus is passing by, she kind of intersects him and reaches down and touches the hem of his garment. Verse 27, when she heard, she came up behind him, touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Verse 29, immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. Verse 30, at once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. So she knew something had happened, and he knew at least that power had gone out of him. We're not told if he knew more than that. I suspect he did, as the story certainly intimates. But now what would you do, or what would you expect Jesus to do given the situation? He is on his way being pulled by Jairus to Jairus' 12-year-old daughter who's dying. What do you expect Jesus to do? You expect him to keep on walking, to make his way through the crowd, follow Jairus, get there as soon as he can in the hopes of maybe saving the 12-year-old. That's what you expect him to do. And yet, that's not what he does. Now, if you want to imagine this a little bit more, imagine yourself. It's Christmas Eve. It's 5 o'clock. You work at FedEx. You've got a mid-management level job. You think your job is over at 5. At 5 o'clock, the boss comes to you and gives you a couple projects that are going to take you about another hour and a half on Christmas Eve, at least. You told your wife you'd be home. Her parents are coming over for dinner. You're making your way back to your office. You know, it's at least going to be 6:30 or 7. And as you're walking back to your office, you pass by another desk of a woman who's at her desk crying. Now, she doesn't see that you see her crying, but she's crying. You know she's crying. What do? You want to get to your office as quickly as possible and get your hour and a half of work done so you can get out of there at 6:30 and try to get home so that the wife is not too mad about you having to work late. And since the woman didn't see you as she was crying, you're really not under any obligation, or so you might think, to stop. But if you did stop, the question to ask is why? Why would you stop? Why would you sit down at her desk and say, tell me what's going on? Why? Verse 30. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my clothes? Now, he does what's unthinkable here. Jairus' daughter dying, crowd, time is of the essence. He stops. He wants to know who touched his clothes. And the question to ask is, why? Why? Verse 31. The disciples said, you see the people crowding around here. Now, they didn't use these words, but, Jesus, sometimes you're a moron. It's kind of the idea here. You ask, who touched me? It's almost like, who didn't touch you? But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. They were apoplectic about this, and yet, you read this, Jesus seems to be on some kind of mission. There's something important here that's even more important than him getting to Jairus' home and trying to save a 12-year-old daughter. What is it? Luke gives a little bit more detail. Who touched me, Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, Peter, of course, Mr. Big Mouth, Master, the people are crowding and pressing around against you. But Jesus said, and here Luke records that he repeated the question, someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me, and the question is why? Luke records at this moment the woman seeing that she could not go unnoticed. What do you hear there? The woman seeing she could not go unnoticed in this crowd of people crushing around him. Was it just that she just realized that he saw her? And there's that knowing look. Is that what he's describing? Is that what the writers here are describing? She could not go unnoticed. She came trembling and fell at his feet. Mark records this. The woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. Now, what's going on here? Every one of us as people, at the deepest desire of who we are, have a longing for relationship. To know other people well and to be known by other people well. This is how we're hardwired for connection. And this drives all of us every day in our lives, whether we're aware of it or not. Will somebody notice me? And I think particularly for, a man has sort of his version of this, but for a woman's greatest fear is, if I really share who I am, will anybody notice? Will anybody care? Or am I just invisible? And there's something here that Jesus is after as he's intent on having a face-to-face conversation with her. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she'd been instantly healed. Mark records the last line. He said to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. Now, something has happened in terms of why did he stop. Something has already happened before he utters these words. It happens in his look, in the connection that he's made with her, that knowing look, where she decides she's not been unnoticed, and she decides to come to him and falls at his feet, trembling. And then, the second part of this, of the answer to why, is words. And the words are simple words. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace, be freed from your suffering. What is he saying to her? He starts off with the word daughter. Now, Jesus was probably 30 years old at the youngest at this moment. And she had been having an issue of blood for 12 years. She was at least 30, I'm guessing, and maybe older than that. Why would he call her daughter? Well, daughter has several different meanings in the Old Testament. It's a term of affection. It's also a picture of tenderness. the love that a father has for a daughter. He calls her daughter. And he's not just describing a familial role. He's saying something tender to her. I'm your dad. You're my girl, my daughter. But in the Old Testament, it also means a child of God for a woman. Something has happened between the moment maybe that she first thought of touching the hem of his garment and the moment that they are now speaking, where something has happened in her heart. And I wonder, we're not told directly, but I wonder, has she just come to Christ in more than just in a personal way? Has she just come to faith? Is there a conversion to Christ here in this? The second thing he says, your faith has healed you. When reading this story, you think about the healing. All of us typically think about the issue of blood for 12 years, and obviously in the story that's been healed. But is that why he stops? Does he stop to tell her, got good news for you. That issue you've had for 12 years, you're not going to have to go to the doctor anymore. Would he have to tell her that? He wouldn't have to tell her that, because within days she's going to know this. And she's going to be happy about that. And she's going to be thankful for that. So when he says your faith has healed you, is he talking about her issue of blood? Is he talking about her physical condition? Or is he talking about her as a woman, as a person? When I think about this, I think about Isaiah 53, one of the great messianic prophecies, where it's said, speaking of the cross and using the analogy of sickness as a picture of our sin, where Isaiah 53:5 says, by your stripes we are healed. And he's not talking about physical infirmity. The cross, the atonement of Christ, deals with the disease of sin in us, that self-centeredness that we can do nothing about in and of ourselves. I think that's what he's saying to her. And it's your faith, simple, childlike trust, that I can do something with that sin nature in you that has dealt with the far deeper problem in you that you have, that everybody has, not just your issue of blood. And it wasn't because you were good enough or you tried hard or you spent extra time at the synagogue. It was simply coming to me in faith. And then he finishes with, go in peace. Now, again, he wouldn't have to tell her this if he was just talking about her physical anomaly. And because within days she would know that the bleeding had stopped, and certainly she would be at peace about that. But why would he stop to tell her, be at peace? I think because she's going to discover that even though she's converted to Christ in this episode, and that she's still going to have to deal with this issue of sin in her life. But even though she still has to deal with the issue of peace, there's something, the deal with sin, there's something in her that can be at peace, even though it's so annoying to deal with. You can be at peace with God even when you're a mess. Even when we still deal with sin. Even when we're still tempted and we still fall flat on our face. I think that's why he stopped to tell her. Very little to do with her physical affection. Very much to do with the story of her life. When I was in college, the girl that I thought I was going to marry, my college sweetheart, broke up with me the first day back my senior year in college. I'd been a Christian all of 9 months. And I remember just being completely blindsided by this. And I drove home. I lived about 20 minutes from campus. It was about midnight, and it's sort of the metaphor of darkness, as I was driving out on the countryside outside of Waco. And in tears and in confusion and heartbroken, I got back to my apartment. I sat down on the bed. I didn't know what to do. This was kind of the first time as a young Christian. I was 20 years old, dealing with heartbreak, and I thought, well, I guess I should read my Bible. I pulled out my Bible, and I thought, I guess I need comfort. And so, well, where do I go in the Bible to get comfort? And so still being a novice, I thought, well, I've never read the book of Romans. I'll start there. I read chapter 1, not much comfort there. Chapter 2, no comfort there. Chapter 3, no comfort there. Chapter 4, no comfort there. Chapter 5, when I read verses 3, 4, and 5, I closed my Bible. I read what I needed that moment. Paul says in Romans 5, 3 through 5, more than that, we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces perseverance, and perseverance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not disappoint us because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. And I had a different metric of how to evaluate God's care. God was doing something in me. He was changing my very character. And rather than this being a season of discouragement, it should be a season of hope. Why? Because I had discovered something personal and tender of the love of God for me, even in a rotten situation. That's something of the story here that we've just read here. Jesus came to tell us about who God is, to reveal the wonder of who God is. And it sort of reminds me of a little kindergartner who was at school, and they were all the kids were drawing a picture, their favorite picture, and the teacher was walking up and down the aisle looking at the pictures. And the kindergartner teacher stopped at one girl's picture, and she was trying to look and see what in the world this girl was drawing. And finally she just said, well, tell me about your drawing, which is code for, you're about the worst artist I've ever seen. I have no idea what you're doing. Please tell me that's something. And the little 5-year-old said, I'm drawing a picture of God. And the teacher was puzzled by that, and she's not really sure how to respond. She said, well, nobody really knows what God looks like. Without missing a beat, the little 5-year-old said, they will in a minute. We learn a lot about God in the story we just studied. As we see the face of Jesus, the attitudes, his words, his care, and I think tenderness. A couple months ago, I was studying this passage, and I wrote a poem. It's in your handout. You can take it home if you'd like to keep it. It's about this story. Amidst the massive crowd which threatened to crush him, lurked a nameless woman, her story of suffering. 12 years of doctors' help just made her bleeding worse. Money spent on doctors, no penny in her purse. If I can just touch him, I know I will be healed. She snaked her way toward him, trying to be concealed. To free her suffering, could he, the bleeding stem? Coming up behind him, she touched his garment's hem. Power went out of him. He knew it instantly. He turned around to look. Who touched me? Timidly. His men asked, look, the crowd. Who would ask that question? His focus was her heart, a grace-filled redemption. Jesus scanning for an invisible woman. More than physical health, the heart of a human. Love without connection? No. She must see his face. She must know God's delight, the wonders of his grace. Amongst the entire crowd, at last he spotted her. Love's eyes began their work. Her fearful heart did stir. She came trembling with fear. She knew she had been healed. She told him her story. Joy, her new heart did yield. Oh, take heart, dear daughter. It's your faith that healed you. More than just her body, her heart, saved through and through. Freed from your suffering, her bleeding then did cease. She and God's family, now you can go in peace. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you for sending your Son, Jesus Christ, that we might see your very heart, that you love people and you hate disconnection. And yet we are so resistant to you. We are so independent. We so want to run our own lives. We so believe we know what to do to make life work. And the last thing we need is to think that we need you. And yet there's nothing more important in all of life than being known by you and knowing you, because it affects all of the rest of our life and all the rest of our relationships so powerfully. Would you do among us what you did for this woman's heart that day? Would you help us to see the need, not just of our physical life, but in our heart? And our need of a deep connection that no other human connection can possibly touch. And then with wonder discover that you love us more than anybody possibly can and ever will. And that you are delighted when we are in your presence.
We at Pacific Church of Irvine invite you to join us every Sunday at 9:30. You can also visit our website at pacificchurch.com.